Okay, so when you're creating a piece of music, how do you find the melody?
The first thing that I work with in terms of the melody is how will that melody express the text? Now, obviously, you all know this piece and you did it very beautifully. And you found out that this was not one of a piece that was going to be, right? It was not going to be about jazzy rhythm and fast, intense music. The poetry would not have let me do that. It was more thoughtful, isn't it? And more introspective. It asks some interesting questions about the transformation of the flower. And so that's part of it right there, is what style of melody. So in creating melody for this particular piece, I was trying to express the meaning of the text. Something we call text painting in music composition. And so you often found that those phrases were long and lyric, that they had expressive intervals, that as the text moved through, as I moved through the expression of the text, the melody was very closely tied to both the flow of the words and the meaning of the words. So, I mean, that still sounds kind of clinical in a way. You know, how do you come up with melody? You know, you make it up. I'm often at the piano and will noodle around in whatever key that I'd like to begin in. And when I was writing this piece, I had to keep in mind the ranges. It's very different to write for middle school choir than it is for high school choir or college choir. And so I was thinking of the key center, where might the melody fall in the range to keep it accessible for the singers who are going to be singing. And then I think what finally it comes down to in writing melody is imagination. You work with certain intervals and then you keep some of these, you would discard some of the other ones. You know, it really comes down to some kind of creative impulse that creates the melody. I think all of those things I just said are part of it, and then in the end, it really comes down to what does your mind tell you? If you've ever written a melody or come up with a melody, maybe many of you have done that, just even outside, you know, walking down the street. Making up a melody is something that anybody can do. But I think composers maybe try and take that to a little further extent. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. What was your favorite piece of music that you've written or performed, and why?
My favorite that I've written and performed. You know, that's a really hard question because there are so many at different levels. It's like, what's your favorite movie? You know, it may be what's your favorite romantic comedy, what's your favorite drama, it's hard to maybe put it all into the same basket and then say there's just one. I think I go back to certain pieces that I've written across my career that stand out as personal favorites at in various genres or various types of music. One of them, and I think I would maybe just illustrate one or two, is I'm trying to think of how old you all would be, but how old were you when all this class when 9/11 happened? Okay, so that's really telling to me that the events of 9/11 are history to you, right? They're really not something that you were aware of. It's part of your history. You all know about it, but it's part of your history. Well, at the time of that event, just shortly after, the American Choral Directors Association asked me to write a piece about that event to be performed at the National Convention of the American Choral Directors Association. And so I wrote a piece called Memorial. And it's about a half-hour long piece with big orchestra and soloists and chorus. And it is all about the events of 9/11 and rather realistically portrays the drama of what happened there. And then also ends with a kind of prayer for peace. And so when I think of that piece in terms of the investment that I put in it and the amount of time I spent writing it, the final product that came out, that would be one of my favorites. Although I can also say that there's a variety of number of pieces. One called "Oh My Love's Like a Red, Red Rose," which is a love poem that I wrote for my wife on Valentine's Day about 15 years ago. And that's for piano and violin and cello and choir. And that's always been a special piece for me because I surprised her that day with it. It was kind of a fun time. I wrote the piece all in one day, and I went into my choir in the afternoon just with the manuscript that I had multi-copied. I didn't have a piano or string parts. I added that later. And so I gave it to them. We ran through it a couple of times. I said, I'll play something on the piano here. And then we recorded it. We made a tape recording of it. And so I took that recording, and on the way home, I stopped at Hornbacher's Food Mart and got a single red rose. And I took the manuscript paper and rolled it up with the red rose and the tape. And I walked into my wife, who was cooking noodles for dinner at that point. And I was about a half hour late because I stopped to get all this stuff. And I walked in the door and she said, "Where have you been?" Kind of irritated that I was late. And then I knew that I had her right then because I walked up to her with the manuscript and the tape and put the headphones on and had her listen to the recording of "Oh My Love's Like a Red, Red Rose," and gave her the manuscript and the single red rose. And of course she immediately fled into a puddle of tears. And it was a wonderful moment of a Valentine's present. The only trouble with that has been ever since then she says, "What have you done for me lately?" on Valentine's Day. So I have lots of different kinds of pieces that all celebrate different occasions.
Did you have any idols growing up that made you want to be a composer?
Idols growing up that made me want to be a composer. You know, that's again a really good question. I appreciate that. I have to think about that one because I think it was different at different times. When I was about 12 years old, I think, I heard the third movement of the Beethoven Ninth Symphony for the first time. And most people know they're talking about Beethoven Ninth Symphony. Any of you know that, perchance? Okay. It would be unusual, perhaps, for a lot of you to know that, but it's the fourth movement that most people know. Bum, bum, pim, pum, 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 pum. The great Ode to Joy. But I remember hearing the third movement, which is the slow movement, and I remembered how beautiful that was, and it made a real impression on me. And it was kind of early on. I think I was unusual in being about 11 or 12 years old, and that I really did like Beethoven and a classical composer. But so he was, I think, an influence on that stage or that kind of music. But I would also have to admit that when I was 12 and 13, I liked the Beatles quite a lot. The Beatles were brand new when I was a kid, and came out in about 1964, 1965. And so there was elements of popular music that I really liked also. Then I got very enamored later on in college and post-college in the music of Stephen Sondheim. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's written a lot of musical theater, Into the Woods, for instance, and Company and various other works for musical theater. He worked with Leonard Bernstein, who was another idol of mine, both compositionally and as conductor, on West Side Story, the musical West Side Story. So I would say that there's a wide variety of influences from Bernstein to Sondheim to Brahms to Bach to Beethoven. You, as a composer, you glean from everybody. You learn, all kind of goes into the deep background. You learn from everybody that creates music. Good question.
Over the course of this last year, I've arranged a few duets for me and my friend to play. And I was thinking about composing something for us, but I was wondering how or if you do anything to get your inspiration.
You know, inspiration is always a word that's asked of me a lot. Like, where do you get your inspiration? And my glib answer is the paycheck. But to be honest about that, I've found that the old phrase that most of success is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. That you know, there's this image, I think, that sometimes for composers, what they do is sit down at the piano with a piece of manuscript paper and a pencil and look up and say, "Okay, God, I'm ready. Inspire me." It's kind of an amorphous word. It's hard to define inspiration. What does that mean? So I think I kind of go at the idea of inspiration more through the idea of work. That's why I say 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. And even finding inspiration can be work. So it means that you're looking for texts that have meaning for you. And so when you say inspiration, it may start with seeking a text, like I did with your piece, looking to find a text that will, you think, well, that sparked something creative in me. And when I read the text of the two young ladies that composed that poetry, I immediately knew, yes, this is something that I'd like to set. It struck me as being pregnant with creativity, like there's something there that really I could expand upon. So I know what you mean by inspiration, but I would also like to qualify it by saying it's not kind of about waiting. Inspiration is about waiting for something to hit you. It's also part of the journey that in order to be inspired by something, you have to go find that which will inspire you. And when you're talking about choral music or vocal music, isn't that often the text? It comes down to words. I'm really glad to hear that you're interested in writing and that you've done somewhat arranging, you said. Arranging is a good way to start composing, is to take someone else's melody and arrange that. And that will often lead you to areas where in your own consciousness, in your own brain, but that will suggest other ideas to do that to you that are original. So I encourage you to do that, is to stay with that interest that you have. Pursue that interest in composition. And don't be afraid to do it. And don't say, I can't do this, or if I get stuck, quit. For all of us, and I know from myself as a composer sitting at the piano, sometimes I'll have manuscript paper, and I'm writing something, and over there in the corner is a pile of crumpled up sheets. So I'm writing and no, throw it away. That's no good. And so sometimes you start over, or sometimes you go back. Like in the piece that I wrote for you, went back and when I was done with it, no, I'm going to change this interval here. I'm going to change that. So it's always a constant growth process. So what I would say to you in the end is work hard at your inspiration. I think those things all go together. Okay, so keep composing. Okay.
What was your initial response to our performance, as in, do you think it was performed how you thought it would be in your head?
One of the most fun things for any composer is when you hear it for the first time. You either hear it yourself on the piano or you hear it on a computer playback, which is not interesting music at all. If you're familiar with the Finale program and you play it back on Finale, it comes back like a computer voice. And I only use it to check accuracy, if there was anything wrong with any notes or intervals in the score. Yeah, what I would say is that that first time when you hear something new and alive, and you've done it for the first time, that's where I think, wow, that's very exciting. Was what I heard in my mind, did that actually come out? And you guys did this beautifully. It was really very powerful and expressive for me to hear you sing.